But it's lovely to be here with you all this morning. It's great to be able to present some of the work we've been doing over the last 2 years. And Maya, that was a terrific presentation. And I think some of the work that we'll be talking about, logically follow on from some of the work you've been doing as well. So there seems to be some nice connections between the two. So yeah, Kelly and I have been spending a lot of time with Lego. We partly stole this title from one of the honours students, didn't we, Kelly? So thanks to Nate for his genius. But what we've been doing with Lego is trying to see how intergroup inequality might impact people's competitive or compassionate behaviour. So Kelly and I have been playing with Lego for the last 2 years. It's kind of driven us partly mad, but it's also been a lot of fun. Would you say, Kelly?
Yes, it has indeed.
Okay, we'll move on. We'll move on to the...
Go. Sorry. This is just an image of James and I playing Lego. Here you go. And I also just wanted, I thought it'd be a little undignified to Photoshop our other collaborators into this photo without their consent. So we just wanted to thank Yolanda and Maddie for their integral input to the design of the project, as well as our team honours students from 2019 and 2020 who collected the data. So just back to you, James.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, no, we did want to put Yolanda and Maddie on the firefighters, but we just weren't sure and so on. So we just thought play it safe. But no, so yeah, as Kath was alluding to, most of my work is in compassion. So I look mostly at compassion science and how that can impact mental health. And given that this study is starting to look at group behaviour, it's a slightly different context to some of the work I've been doing. But to kind of give more information about what compassion is, we all have our own sense of what compassion is. We all have our own kind of thoughts and memories and ideas of what it is. But this is the definition we tend to use. And that's the sensitivity to suffering in self and others. And that's the first part. And then the second part is to try to do something to alleviate and prevent it. So the first part is really to engage with the suffering. So what we mean by that is how good are you detecting that signal of suffering? Like, does it have to be really high before you step in and start to do something? Or can you notice low signals of suffering and engage with it? And then the second part is to try to do something skillfully in order to alleviate it. So for example, just say if I was at UQ and walking in and I saw Alex Haslam drowning in the Brisbane River, I might think to myself, oh my God, I must save Alex. Oh, the sign group will fall apart. I must jump in and rescue him. And so I jump in midair. I think to myself, oh my goodness, I can't swim. That would be kind of really not very wise, skillful action. So part of it is recognizing that we sometimes can struggle tolerating the distress when we see it. So we can jump in. And then all of a sudden you need two people who need help as opposed to one. So acting skillfully also means working out your own competencies, like what you are capable of doing. And so there's not just one compassionate behaviour. So if I couldn't swim, I might run down to the pool. It's not very far away and ask some of the swimmers up there, could you help Alex out, or call OOO? Or I'd start to look at a range of different behaviours in order to help Alex. But what that really means is the context is really important in how compassion is shown. Okay, just go back just a touch. A lot of us think of the image, I'm pointing to my screen, but you can't see what I'm pointing to, the little boy hugging the girl. A lot of people will often think of compassion as that. So you've got a target who is sad and you might cuddle them and comfort them in order to help reduce the sadness that they're experiencing. However, equally, a compassion action could be two kids fighting and the teacher coming in more assertively and getting them to stop the fighting. But, the teacher isn't walking in with like, oh, my children, we must stop, like in this kind of kind, loving way. Although some might, but I would suspect that's kind of ineffective. You kind of go in a little bit more assertive. Hey, kids, hands down, what's going on? With a little bit more force, perhaps, and energy in an assertive way. Another option is you might be donating blood because you're motivated to help those people who desperately need it as part of a blood transfusion. Now, you never see the target. You never know who that target is. In fact, that target you might really dislike if you knew them. But you're donating that blood for them, so someone in the future who you'll never see. And then, of course, there's the homeless giving some food there. And then this is a teacher in the US who took 4 bullets in a mass shooting at a primary school, to stop his kids in his class getting injured. And when he was interviewed about, what motivated him to do it, he was like, well, I had to prevent the children getting hurt. I had to save them from harm. So that's kind of very heroic sort of compassionate action, if you will. But the emotions in each of those contexts are going to differ quite a lot. The motivation is always to prevent the suffering. But, in the sadness one, you're going to have more sadness. In the fighting one, more assertiveness, perhaps a little bit of slight anxiety or anger. In the needle, for the blood, you might even have some joy, knowing you're going to do something helpful for someone. Whereas for the teacher, it might be a lot of fear, trying to take the bullet. So the emotional patterns that come with those contexts will differ, but the motivation is always to try to alleviate suffering in some way. If you're interested in compassion science, there's a book that was published a couple of years ago that's available in the library, but I also have a copy which you're welcome to borrow as well. And it kind of has around 40 chapters that looks at compassion in relation to sort of the brain and physiology, social connectedness and so on, and children and parenting. It's just a wealth of information in there. I'm not going to go too much into that. It's just to kind of give a plug to compassion in some ways and say that there's a lot of really good work being done. And if you are interested in it, that's a really good resource to start with. In fact, you can get it through the library, all online, free. You can download it as an e-PDF with your UQ login details. So we've talked a lot about compassion, as in terms of a definition going outwards, but there's also a lot of work being done with self-compassion. So we talk a lot about the flow of compassion. And in mental health, for example, a lot of work's being done with self-compassion as a way to help people with distress, anxiety, and depression and so on. So that's directing that compassion towards yourself. But the work we're focusing on is compassion to others. So if another group or another people who need help, and they're the examples I was giving previously. But there's also your capacity to be open to receiving compassion from others. And so that's work that I've been doing in depression, but also some colleagues in Portugal. Is when we factor all of these in, it's often the stronger buffer to depression is your capacity to be open to receiving compassion from others. So a lot of people with depression, they become quite isolated and withdrawal. They kind of don't allow it in, which is kind of awful. So hence why there's a lot of loneliness experienced with depression, which a lot of the sign group and groups for health are really trying to do, which is just fantastic, trying to get that connectedness back. But many can fear it coming in. So you can have a different flow where some people are excellent giving compassion to others, but are not so good letting it in or giving it to themselves. And in fact, we're running a group therapy program at the moment for people with body weight shame. So they've got a BMI of 30 and over. And when they come to the group, they're just so compassionate to each other, just the most lovely people. But as soon as we ask them to direct it to themselves, barriers come up, deflection, they want to avoid. And you see it in the first session when they sort of talk about the distress and some of the awful things they've been called and named. And when they describe it, all the group turn in on them and give them compassion. And you can just see how uncomfortable they are being the target of it coming in. So we do a little bit of exposure in the group format for that. But I suppose how that operates, because you can be high in one and low in another, will be contextual again. So your culture, your family, school, organisation are all going to influence how you see compassion manifest itself. So you might be in a home family environment, which is very loving, warm, trusting, caring, and those compassion aspects will just show itself very nicely. But then you might go to work and it's very toxic, it's bullying perhaps, very, very competitive, and you might not be so compassionate to others. You might hold it all in closely. So there'll be different facilitators and inhibitors to how you might see compassion show itself. And I'll just go through a couple very quickly. So if we think about compassion as being kind of dimensional, in that there's just not one compassionate behavior, there are many different types of compassionate behaviors. And if we look at it the opposite, perhaps the darker side being that insensitivity to suffering and deliberately or purposefully causing harm. Depending on whether or not if you like the target, how similar they are to you, how competent you are, the level of anxiety you're experiencing, how empathic you are you able to get into what the other person could be experiencing, and whether or not there is a cost, that'll move you up that arrow a little bit more to compassion, or if you don't like them, then unsimilar, lots of anxiety, and there's huge costs involved, they'll move you more to the other side. Maybe not to hurting them, but perhaps to not really doing anything, more middle ground or even slightly less. Equally, the roles that we can get into can also influence our compassionate behavior. So whether or not if the person who needs help is your parent or your child, your friend. I mean, some of the clients I see in private practice, I wouldn't be friends with them. Some of the things they've done are just awful. But I'm so compassionately motivated to try to heal their hurt so they don't hurt others. But they aren't particularly people I would want to be, around a lot. I mean, that's not all my clients, but that's certainly some of them. But that role, I'm sort of motivated to be as compassionate to help them with that. And same with your colleagues. Although everyone at UQ is beautiful, so I'm going to be compassionate to everyone. And then two other factors that can really impact compassionate behaviour is whether or not if you see them in that role as being a competitor or if it's a group. And they're the two key things that we were looking at in our study. It was kind of serendipitous in some ways. I was just surfing the internet and just stumbled across this blog and it was titled Compassionate, What Happens When Compassion Meets Competition. This was probably 4 years ago. Or maybe less, maybe 3 years ago. And it was this group called Compassionate came into this high school and they gave a 45-minute compassionate workshop, work through the definition, do some compassion meditations. They gave them all compassionate wristbands. So that black wristband around their wrist says compassionate. And so they talked them all through that. Then after that, they put them in this activity where it was like the UN really. And they would be assigned to either high-income countries, like the US, or low-income countries, say Mozambique or something like that, where it's a much lower GDP. And depending on the high or low income nature of the country, they had either a lot of Lego, or if they were low income, not much Lego at all. And then they were instructed to create as much food as they could, as a whole group, create as much food as they could. And what they found was the high-income countries that had a lot of food would make a lot, but the low income just didn't really have that much. They would approach the high income countries for food, but they wouldn't share. So it was assumed it was a competition. I mean, if you want to find out more, there's 2 links that you can go to find out more about that particular workshop. I mean, it's not a study, but it was just something that they did that I found very interesting. But Kelly, what were some of the other things that they said? Like America said something around, what the group from America?
Yeah, so I think the group from America had a lot of extra sort of pieces that they didn't need, and a lot of the low-income countries would come up to them and ask them for some of those pieces. And the person facilitating the session sort of said to, the American group, oh, why didn't you give them those pieces? And the kids said back to them, oh, it's because we're America. So it was kind of funny that they really took on the sort of attributes of the country as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's so funny, isn't it? But yeah. So that was what was interesting. So they'd already gone through a 45-minute workshop on compassion. So you'd think they'd be more open to it. But yeah, compassion didn't really work. And so perhaps there was something with this competitive nature that can go on with the inequalities. So I got really excited by this, spoke to Maddie about it. Maddie was pretty excited by it as well. And that led to us, reaching out to Yolanda. And so we were able to have some really good conversations with her and also Kelly, where we wanted to make that study more rigorous. I mean, there are some issues with it. Some of the tables were very much scattered, which means you don't see the different countries, and that could have impacted what they did and so on. So we really wanted to make it a more rigorous study and also get a sense of, with that inequality, it does prime sort of competition, as Maya was really getting to in her past talk. So we wanted to see, were there things that we could do that could try to overcome some of that competitive aspect that can come with inequality. So Kelly does a lot of work in inequality. So Kelly, I'll give it over to you.
Yeah, so as James mentioned, one of our main goals for these series of studies was to create a paradigm that made a sort of more rigorous and controlled version of that Lego activity that was done with the school children. And so what that paradigm really does is it puts people in situations of inequality. And inequality is something that's been researched a lot, as you would have just heard from Mai. And it's been found in past to decrease pro-social behaviour, enhance feelings of competition, and also increase perceptions of us versus them. And these are all sorts of behaviours that we can see, at least at face value, coming out in those children when they are engaging in this activity. But it's important to note that what all of this research really explores is what happens when individuals have differences in resources or money. But what we really hope to do in this context was explore what inequality between groups. And we think this is a phenomenon that's much less examined in the literature. So with all of that in mind, what we want to do was first of all create that paradigm and then look at what sort of interventions and manipulations we could bring in that could potentially shift compassionate behaviour and competitive behaviour under those situations of intergroup inequality. So there were a few sort of interventions that we came up with, and the first one was the degree of inequality itself. So we were just interested in just how that might shift those particular behaviours. There's also been a lot of research, and particularly in the clinical space that James is involved with, that has suggested that compassion training and compassion meditation can influence people's pro-social behaviour. And so we wanted to introduce a sort of short-term version of that to see if that would then change our participants' behaviour. And finally, as I'm sure everyone in this group is aware, the sort of norms that we have within our groups can have dramatic effects on our behaviour. And so we wanted to see what the introduction of a group norm that would try and incite that compassionate behaviour, to see if that would influence the behaviour as well. So I'm going to go through a sort of general overview of our paradigm, and this is the sort of method we used across all three of those studies. And I'll go into the specific details of those three studies later on. So in our experimental room, we had a table like this, and on this table we had 2 boxes full of Lego. So what you can see here is this box up here has a lot of colourful pieces of Lego, and this one down here has a few colourful pieces of Lego, but it's mostly these sorts of non-coloured brown, black, white, grey pieces of Lego here. Now we brought participants into the lab and we assigned them to one side of the table each. And we called this group over here the high resource group, and this one was the low resource group. And what you can hopefully see here is that the prize resource in this context is that colourful Lego. We then told participants, today you've all been placed into 2 groups. This group here represents a country called Nashaland, and this group represents a country called Lindithia. And as you can probably guess, these are fictitious countries. Participants were then told several demographic details about their particular country, and these are the descriptions here. So it's just basic information that we've made up about climate, population, local delicacies. And we did this to really make that sort of idea that they were a country much more salient. Participants were then told the aim of the task. So they were told the aim of today is to produce as much food as you can. You create food by assembling the Lego pieces just like this. Watch me. The experiment would then show participants how they assembled a food piece. So this is one food piece here. And the key sort of ingredient here was that it had to be in this particular colour order. It had to go from blue, green, yellow, and red in order for it to be counted as a food piece. The shape of the Lego pieces itself didn't matter so long as it was in the right colour order. Participants were then told you should create as much food as possible. And ultimately, we're looking at creating as much food as possible so no one will starve. You have 5 minutes to do this to the best of your ability. And hopefully what you can see here, based on the definition of compassion that James introduced to us at the start, is that creating food in this context is a compassionate act because it's addressing a suffering element here, which is starving. So just a quick note on the distribution of Lego. So we kept it standard across all sort of testing sessions that there were 500 colourful pieces in the high resource group box and about 100 colourful pieces in the low resource group box. And what this meant was that the high resource group could potentially create around 125 food pieces, whereas the low resource group could only create about 25 food pieces. We did it in this way to assure that the high resource group had way more than they could possibly sort of assemble in the time given to them, which was 5 minutes, and that the low resource group had not enough. So they would finish within about 2 or 3 minutes of the sort of assembly process. And so in order to maximize the food creation here, what the groups really need to do is work together. And that's really the only way they can possibly maximize that food creation. So this brings me to our key measure, which is compassionate behaviour here. And so we, as I mentioned, operationalise compassionate behaviour as maximising the amount of food that can be created. So of course, our key DV was the amount of food the groups and individuals made. We were then, as I mentioned earlier as well, interested in the exchange of pieces. And that's because that's the only way to really maximise the food that can be created in this context. And so we were interested in the exchange of pieces from the high resource group to the low resource group here. And so this sort of sharing of pieces could be sort of, I suppose, brought up by the high resource group here, where they could offer their pieces or give their pieces. But it could also be initiated by the low resource group here as well, where they could ask for Lego pieces or they could even just take pieces. And finally, we were interested in the efficiency of food making. So that's the amount of food made per minute. And of course, as it would sort of suggest, the faster participants worked, the more food that was made, and that would be therefore, based on our definition, more compassionate. We were also interested in competitive behaviour, and we took these measures at the end of the task in a pen to paper questionnaire where we asked participants, to what extent did you feel this task was a competition between the two countries? And to what extent did you feel the context was one of us versus them? So these were on a 10-point scale from not at all agree to highly agree. And before I go into specific details on each experiment itself, I just wanted to make a note overall on our analytic approach to this project. So we made things a little bit complicated for ourselves because we actually have a nested design here. And what I mean by that is that what an individual does depends on what their group does. So for example, if this participant had said suddenly, you know what, I think we should share our pieces with the other group. And perhaps this participant over here hadn't thought about that. And they sort of say, oh, you know, great idea. I didn't think about that. I'm going to share as well. And so in that sense, the individual behaviour may be somewhat dependent on the group behaviour. So to account for this, we ran mixed effects models to control for the influence of the group in that context. So our three experiments, as I alluded to earlier, looked at the effect of the degree of inequality, compassion training, and the introduction of a compassionate group norm on compassionate and competitive behaviour in this paradigm. So I'll start first of all with our first study here. So as I mentioned earlier, this was our distribution of Lego that we had between our two resource groups here. So this made up one condition in which we called standard inequality. And what we were interested in was how the degree of inequality influenced their behaviour. So we made this extreme inequality condition where we made the inequality much more stark. So what you can see here is that in our standard inequality condition, there's 100 colourful pieces where they can make about 25 food items. However, in our extreme inequality condition, we changed this. So there's only 40 colourful pieces, so they can only make about 10 food items. So participants in this resource group basically run out of things to do within about a minute of the task. And we wanted to do it in this way to see if it really takes an extreme, blatantly obvious and dire lack of resources before individuals are motivated to share and work together. So basic details of the experiment, we ran about 33 sessions and our group sizes ranged depending on sort of whether the first year showed up or not. And we had a pretty typical split in terms of demographics, as you would expect from a first year in a paid pool population. So how many Lego pieces were shared? So on this graph here, we have the number of Lego pieces shared here. And we also have our two resource groups down here. And so in blue here, we have our extreme inequality condition. And we can see here that the high resource group didn't really initiate much sharing, but the low resource group did seem to in this context. And when we compare that to standard inequality, we can see there's a difference in behaviour here. So we get a main effective condition and resource group. So ultimately what that means is that participants in the extreme inequality condition were more likely to share compared to standard inequality, and high resource participants were much less likely to share than low resource participants. So what we can imagine happening here is that those low resource participants in extreme inequality were probably sitting there thinking, hey, you know what, we haven't got anything to do. You guys should give us your pieces there. But the key dependent variable here is, did this actually result in more food being made? So first of all, we have our food pieces made here on this scale by each individual. And we can see that, as you would expect, more food was made by the high resource participants compared to the low resource participants. And this is in extreme inequality. And when we compare that to standard inequality, we can see a very similar pattern. So we have no effect here of condition, which means that that extreme inequality condition, despite the fact that more Lego pieces were shared, it didn't actually result in more food being created. And did it influence the participants' work rate? Well, first of all, we have the efficiency score here, which is the number of food pieces made per minute. And we can see that our high resource group in extreme inequality are working much faster than the low resource group down here. And when we compare this to our standard inequality condition, we see a very similar pattern coming out. So what it really looks like is happening here is that despite the condition, our low resource group is working at a very slow rate compared to our high resource participants. And again, no effective condition. And we also found no difference in conditions or resource group in terms of how competitive the participants perceive the task to be and whether or not they perceive the context to be one of us versus them. It's interesting to note, though, that when you just look at the sort of mean scores or the mode scores here collapsed across all of these conditions, is that participants were really seeing this paradigm and this context as something that was highly competitive. And that's interesting because, you know, we didn't say that it was a competition between the groups, and we didn't say they had to make food for their own group. But they assumed, like the sort of kids at the school did, that it was a competition. So overall, what this experiment showed us is that participants did share more when they were faced with extreme inequality, and we can see it was largely initiated by the low resource group. But this didn't result in more food being created or faster work rates. So it didn't really influence this compassionate behaviour in the way that we had hoped for. And so we also found that regardless of condition, participants really did perceive this context to be highly competitive. So we moved on from this experiment to our second one, which is then looking at the role of compassion training and how that may influence behaviour in this context. So compassion training is something, like I mentioned, is done a lot in the clinical space, and this is something James works with a lot in his other studies. And what this usually is a sort of meditative exercise, and it generally occurs in 4 steps. First, you start slowing down your breathing and grounding the body. Then you imagine being compassionate to another individual. You also connect to the definition of compassion, and then are asked to imagine actually engaging in some sort of compassionate act. We then compared this to a condition called focus imagery, which we thought served as an ideal control. So focus imagery is a meditation exercise where you sort of think about your body in space and you sort of focus on your breathing, but there's no compassion element involved whatsoever. Now, both of these were 10-minute audio clips that our participants listened to before they heard the aim of the task. And both of these were recorded by James himself. And so I think a lot of us, you know, we know James, we see him around the School of Psychology hallways, and he's a very sort of animated and energetic individual, but he's also got this other side to him, which I call the sort of meditative guru side to him.
I haven't seen that. That's what it does look like underneath the shirt. Yeah, it's incredible.
So I thought it would be sort of an interesting thing to show you all what these kinds of training exercises actually sound like. And so I've got a little brief clip from the compassion training one for you all to listen to. So hopefully everyone can hear it.
And now to finish off with the exercise, I'd just like you to imagine you've become this ideal compassionate person. if you were this ideal compassionate person, how would you engage with the world? How would you respond to yourself when in pain or struggling? How would you like to respond to others when they are suffering?
I'm suffering now, Kelly. You might want to stop.
Okay.
There we go. That's the serene guru, James, that now everyone's been exposed to. So we had a few more sessions in this experiment. We were able to collect more participants for this. And we had relatively similar group sizes depending on how many participants would turn up. And also a very similar sort of demographic description of our participant pool as in the prior experiment. And so what did we find? So we found no difference in our two conditions in terms of the number of Lego pieces shared, nor did we find a difference between our resource groups. We also found no difference between our conditions in how many food pieces were made. We did have a main effect though, as you would expect, that the high resource group made more food than the low resource group. And also we didn't find any difference in condition on terms of how fast participants worked. Now, again, we did find what you would expect, which is that our high resource group worked faster than our low resource group. We also got no effect whatsoever in terms of our two competition questions here. And so what this really tells us is that compassion training in this context does nada. And this made Guru James very upset. He was very hopeful for this one. But when we were sort of talking about this afterwards, it was quite obvious to us why this was the case. So a lot of the compassion training literature has, engaged participants in this training for a long period of time. And so what this really suggests is that our brief 10-minute intervention doesn't really seem to be influencing behaviour. But it's also interesting to note as well that the compassion training is very much an individual exercise. However, what might be happening here is that maybe it does make individuals feel more compassionate, but when they go into this experiment, they're then put into a sort of group, and perhaps those group dynamics and those group pressures really override whatever that individual may be feeling at the time. So we moved on from that and we finally looked at our third experiment, which was looking at the effect of a group norm and how that influenced behaviour. So we did this in quite a fun way. So we added a confederate into our high resource group here. So our confederate, we had two different conditions here. And in our compassionate group norm condition, our confederate was instructed to make comments every 1 minute of the task. So this is during the Lego assembly. So in the first minute of Lego assembly, the confederate said, "It looks like they don't have enough Lego." They then said on the second minute, "Do you think we should share our Lego?" Followed by, "I think we should share with them." And finally, "Here, have some Lego," and they physically share those Lego pieces. So what you can see here is that it increases with intensity as time goes on, and they're really trying to encourage that sort of compassionate behaviour. Now we compared this to a control where we had a confederate in the high resource group who basically just commented on their enjoyment of Lego, and our honours students really hated this one. So they said, "I like playing with Lego. Do you like playing with Lego? It's been a long time since I've played with Lego, and Lego is really fun." So these are sort of very similar descriptions as I've shown you earlier for the other experiments. So let's look at Lego pieces shared. So what we can see here with our Lego pieces shared, we've got our group norm condition up here, and we can see that, sort of sharing was initiated in this condition by our low and high resource group at very similar rates. And when we compare this to our control condition, we can see here that we've got a huge difference. And we did indeed get a main effective condition, that our group norm influenced and resulted in much more sharing compared to our control condition. But like I said earlier, our key DVs, did that actually result in any more food being created? So here we've got our group norm condition, and we can see, as you would expect, the high resource group did make more food pieces than the low resource group. But when we compare that to our control condition, we do see some condition differences emerging here. So in that group norm condition, we saw more food being made compared to the control condition. And did it result in participants working faster? Well, here we can see, as we found prior, high resource group worked faster in our group norm condition compared to low resource group. And again, it looks very similar to what we found in the control condition. So our group norm condition, despite more food being shared and more food being made, our low resource group continued to work at this very slow pace. And that was an interesting finding that I think James is going to unpack a little more at the end. So moving on to our competitive measures. So did the participants perceive the task to be more or less competitive? And here we can see with our group norm condition, our high resource and low resource groups thought it was similarly competitive. And when we compare that to a control condition, we get some interesting effects here. So what we got here was a main effective resource group, so that our low resource group felt it was much more competitive compared to our high resource group. And you can probably see here we have something that looks like an interaction effect, but it didn't come out as significant. I think it was P is 0.06. But I guess if we're going to say that, it's going to trending towards the group norm condition attenuating that sort of feeling of competitiveness that low resource group is feeling here. But of course, like I mentioned, that was non-significant. And finally, in terms of whether they perceived it to be a context of one of us versus them, we can see in our group norm condition, the feelings are very similar for the high resource group and the low resource group, but we see a difference emerging here in our control condition. So participants in our control condition felt like it was much more of a context of us versus them compared to those in the group norm condition. And again, we got a sort of main effective resource group, where the low resource group felt it was much more of a sort of context of us versus them compared to the high resource group. So all in all, what we found here was that when the Confederate introduced a group norm, we found more Lego was shared, more food was created, in-group, out-group perceptions were reduced, but participants didn't work any faster. And that's a phenomenon James and I are quite interested in. So I might throw it back to James here to discuss that one a bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Essentially, the low resource group people are just bad people. So we can finish there. No. I mean, that really surprised us, I suppose. But we've been trying to unpack this a little bit, and I suspect some of you might have some ideas. One idea is just that low resource group were demotivated from the start. They just didn't have many pieces. Randy Ness, an evolutionary psychiatrist, often talks about in the context of depression, when you're in an environment with low resource, the crucial resource is low, you don't see much effort put in to trying to access the resource because it's just not there. So it would be a waste or would result in some kind of loss. So it's kind of adaptive to down-regulate in that context. I mean, he takes it to an extreme where some animals will hibernate when there just isn't access to resource. So perhaps our group here is just seeing quite clearly, we haven't got access to resource. There's no point working fast. And put effort in, we'll just work slowly. Another one is, I've been talking to Craig Jacobson. He works at the UQ Energy Initiative as part of the Energy and Poverty Research Group. He does a lot of work with social systems and trying to get social systems change. And in our lab meetings, when we were sort of talking about some of this work, he kind of presented this idea of path dependence, which I hadn't heard of before. But essentially, path dependence kind of means the history matters. So whatever the history has been for that group, that will influence what they tend to do, regardless of whatever the intervention is. So often you can think the intervention will come in and it'll shift, but what's been happening previously matters a great deal more than what that intervention is, unless the intervention has some unique facets to it that ours really didn't have to the degree that we would have wanted. But he sent me this graphic which kind of highlights in a sort of a social systems kind of perspective, what we were kind of seeing. So we've got time on the x-axis and compassionate behaviour on the y. And we've got that inequality between the groups, and they've been working at their rates at baseline. And at that point of intervention of what we were bringing in, whether it be a meditation or perhaps the group norm prompting, we were hoping that would lead to the desired behaviour on the green line. We're hoping that would be the case. but often it was just continued the actual behaviour, particularly in terms of efficiency. The groups didn't work any faster. That red line just continued, even though we brought it in. But with the Confederate, we did see more food being made. So it did see an upswing, but it would only happen in about the second or third minute, which was the second or third prompt. So the sharing would happen at the second or third prompt, which therefore gave the low resource group more pieces to continue to make food at that slow rate for those remaining minute 4, minute 5. So they didn't work any faster. They kept the same rate, but they had more resource to continue to work at a slow rate so they could work to the 5th minute, which led to more food being made. So perhaps, the fact that it was a top-down kind of intervention where the high resource group gave pieces to the low resource group wasn't really motivating or inspiring for the low resource group to work any faster. So one of the ideas that we have is perhaps if it was the low resource group, if we were to plant a Confederate in the low resource group, and where that sharing does occur, perhaps it kind of starts to shift into more of a leadership kind of intervention, perhaps, where the low resource group Confederate might say, oh, we can create more food now that we've got more pieces, we can work faster. Something along those lines in terms of the prompts might be more motivating for the group. So it's kind of, a within the group kind of process, as opposed to being kind of given it from a higher resource group. So we had started running that experiment. We'd put 5 groups through that condition with the Confederate and the low resource group, and it was looking very favorable. But then COVID hit and we couldn't do the study anymore because you can't have got to have social distancing and so on. So we've had to put this study on hold for quite some time because that's going to have a big impact on the group behaviour. But they're just some ideas on perhaps why the low resource group, despite having the pieces to work faster, not perhaps working faster. They're just a couple that we've got at the moment. But that's about it from Kelly and I. But thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Kelly, for all the work you've been doing on the project in trying to make sense of the analyses and how we're going about creating the paradigm in the first place. But thank you very much, everyone.